Some secrets are written in scars, carved into skin by choices that changed everything. Dr. Sarah Chun thought she understood trauma until she walked into a military briefing room where silence held more weight than words, and a single glance at her wrist made a decorated Navy SEAL commander freeze mid-sentence. What happens when the observer becomes the observed? When the person sent to study warriors discovers that some battles leave marks that never fade, and some connections transcend every protocol ever written. In a world where strength is measured by what you can endure and vulnerability is considered weakness, two people are about to discover that the most dangerous missions aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought in the space between heartbeats, where truth lives and walls crumble. This is the story of recognition, of two souls who found each other in the last place, either expected to find hope. Because sometimes the most important discovery isn't what you're looking for. It's what finds you when you're finally ready to be found. Dr. Sarah Chun had spent 3 years studying the invisible wounds of war, but she had never felt smaller than she did walking through the gates of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The morning fog clung to the Pacific coastline, and she pulled her jacket tighter as she followed Lieutenant Morrison toward the briefing facility. Her credential badge felt heavier than it should have, marking her as an outsider in a world where belonging was earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice she had never known. "Remember, Doctor, you're here to observe," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of following orders and giving them. "The SEALs have agreed to participate in your PTSD research study, but they're not thrilled about it. Some of these men have been through more deployments than most people have jobs. They don't open up easily." Sarah nodded, adjusting her recorder and notepad. She had interviewed hundreds of veterans, but never active duty special operations forces. The statistics were staggering. Suicide rates among special operations personnel were climbing, and the military was finally acknowledging that even their most elite warriors weren't immune to psychological trauma. Her research on adaptive coping mechanisms had caught the attention of the Pentagon, leading to this unprecedented access. The briefing room was sterile and cold, with fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows on the faces of 12 Navy SEALs seated around a conference table. Sarah took her assigned seat in the corner, trying to make herself invisible while her eyes swept across the room. These men looked like they had been carved from stone, broad shoulders, weathered faces, eyes that had seen things she could only read about in case studies. At the head of the table stood Commander Marcus Kane, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair showing traces of silver at the temples. His face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting in a desert sun and making split-second decisions that meant life or death for his team. But it was his eyes that held her attention, deep blue, almost navy, and carrying a weight that spoke of responsibility she couldn't begin to fathom. "Gentlemen," Kane began, his voice commanding immediate attention. "Dr. Chun is here to study how we process and cope with operational stress. I want full cooperation, but I also want honesty. If participating in this study compromises your effectiveness or mental health, you tell me immediately." One of the younger SEALs, who couldn't have been more than 25, raised his hand. "Sir, what exactly does she want to know?" Kane's eyes flicked to Sarah, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Dr. Chun, would you like to explain your research?" Sarah stood on unsteady legs, her academic confidence wavering under the scrutiny of men who risked their lives while she sat safely in university libraries. "I'm studying adaptive coping mechanisms in high-stress military environments. Specifically, I want to understand how special operations personnel process traumatic experiences and maintain operational effectiveness." "So you want to know how we deal with the bad stuff without falling apart," said a gruff voice from the back. The speaker was a massive man with arms covered in tattoos and scars that told stories Sarah could only guess at. "Essentially, yes," Sarah replied. "But I'm more interested in resilience factors than pathology. What makes some individuals more adaptable to extreme stress than others. Commander Kane moved closer to her corner of the room, and Sarah caught the scent of his cologne mixed with something indefinably masculine: leather, salt air, and discipline. "How long have you been studying veterans, Doctor?" 3 years of focused research, but I've been working with trauma survivors for nearly 7 years total. She tried to keep her voice steady, professional. "And what makes you think you can understand what we go through?" The question came from a SEAL with sergeant stripes, his tone challenging but not hostile. Sarah had faced this question before, and she had prepared an answer. But looking at these men, she realized her standard academic response fell hollow. "I can't understand your experiences," she said quietly. "I've never been shot at, never had to make the decisions you make, never carried the responsibility you carry. But I've spent years listening to people process trauma, and I've learned that sometimes an outside perspective can help identify patterns that might not be visible from the inside." Something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The hostility didn't disappear, but it lessened slightly. Commander Kane returned to his position at the front. "The first rule of this program is voluntary participation. No one is required to speak with Dr. Chun. The second rule is confidentiality. What you share with her stays with her unless it indicates immediate danger to yourself or others. The third rule is that this research might help the next generation of operators deal with the psychological toll of this job." He paused, scanning the faces of his men. "I've read Dr. Chin's previous work. She's not here to fix us or tell us we're broken. She's here to understand what makes us effective so that future SEALs can be better prepared for what this job demands." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah observed the team's morning briefing with fascination. These men operated with a level of coordination and communication that bordered on telepathic. They could shift from joking about weekend plans to discussing life and death tactical scenarios without missing a beat. The way they processed information, assessed risks, and made decisions revealed a kind of cognitive flexibility that most people never developed. Commander Kane dominated the room not through volume or aggression, but through competence and calm authority. When a young SEAL hesitated over a tactical question, Kane guided him through the thought process without making him feel stupid. When another operator challenged a decision, Kane listened carefully and adjusted the plan based on valid input. During a brief break, Sarah found herself standing near the coffee station when Commander Kane approached. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just blue. They had flecks of gray that reminded her of stormy seas. "How are you finding your first morning with us, Dr. Chun?" "Eye-opening," she admitted. "Your team dynamics are remarkable. The level of trust and communication is unlike anything I've observed in civilian populations." Kane poured coffee into a mug that bore the SEAL trident. "Trust isn't optional in our line of work. When you're depending on someone to watch your back in a firefight, personality conflicts become secondary to survival. Is that how you cope? By focusing on the practical rather than the emotional?" He studied her for a moment, and Sarah felt exposed under his gaze. "You're already analyzing us." Heat flooded her cheeks. "I'm sorry. It's occupational hazard. I tend to observe patterns," he finished. "It's fine. That's why you're here." He took a sip of coffee. "To answer your question, we cope by doing our jobs. Everything else is luxury we can't afford. But what happens when the job is over? When you come home?" Something flickered across his features, too quick to identify. "That's when it gets complicated." The afternoon session involved individual interviews, and Sarah was surprised when half the team volunteered to participate. She had expected resistance, but these men seemed genuinely interested in contributing to research that might help other operators. Her first interview was with Petty Officer Rodriguez, a 28-year-old from Texas who had completed 4 deployments. He spoke candidly about the challenges of transitioning between combat zones and home life, describing a psychological compartmentalization process that allowed him to function effectively in both environments. "It's like having 2 different operating systems," he explained. "Overseas, I'm running on survival software, hyper-vigilant, aggressive, ready for anything. At home, I need to switch to civilian software, patient, gentle, normal. The problem is that the switch isn't always clean. The second interview was with Chief Petty Officer Williams, the tattooed giant who had challenged her earlier. Despite his intimidating appearance, he was articulate and thoughtful, describing how physical fitness served as both stress relief and team bonding. Pain is temporary, but the brotherhood is forever, he said. When we're pushing each other through hell week or a brutal training session, we're building connections that go deeper than friendship. We're literally trusting each other with our lives. By late afternoon, Sarah had conducted 6 interviews and filled 2 notebooks with observations. Each conversation revealed new layers of complexity in how these men process stress and maintained mental resilience. They weren't invulnerable. Several had struggled with anxiety, depression, or relationship problems, but they had developed sophisticated coping mechanisms that deserved serious academic study. As the day wound down, Commander Kane approached her corner workspace. "How did your first day go, Doctor?" "Better than I expected," she admitted, organizing her notes. "Your men are incredibly insightful about their own psychological processes. Most people can't articulate their coping mechanisms with this level of detail. Special operations selection tends to attract people who are comfortable with introspection," Kane said. "You have to understand your own limitations and capabilities to survive what we put ourselves through." Sarah looked up from her notes, studying his face. "What about you, Commander? Are you comfortable with introspection?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his composed mask slipped, and she glimpsed something vulnerable beneath the surface. "I've learned that knowing yourself is essential for leading others," he said carefully. "But some kinds of self-knowledge are more dangerous than useful." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Lieutenant Morrison appeared in the doorway. "Commander, you're needed in the ops center." Kane straightened, shifting instantly back into command mode. "Dr. Chun, thank you for today. I'll see you tomorrow morning." As he walked away, Sarah found herself staring after him, puzzled by their brief exchange. There had been something in his eyes when she asked about introspection, a flash of recognition, maybe even fear. That evening, in her hotel room overlooking the Pacific, Sarah transcribed her interview notes and tried to process everything she had observed. These men were far more complex than the stoic warrior stereotype suggested. They were thoughtful, articulate, and emotionally intelligent in ways that challenged many assumptions about masculine psychology and military culture. But it was Commander Kane who occupied most of her thoughts. There was something about him that felt familiar, though she couldn't identify what. His psychological profile was fascinating, a leader who commanded through competence rather than intimidation, who could switch between tactical analysis and genuine empathy without missing a beat. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the bathroom mirror and unconsciously tugged at her sleeve, ensuring it covered the thin scar that ran along her left wrist. The mark was old, nearly invisible now, but it represented the darkest period of her life, a time when she had understood trauma from the inside rather than as an academic subject. She had been 22, overwhelmed by graduate school, and a relationship that had turned emotionally abusive. The scar was a reminder of a night she had almost given up entirely, and of the therapist who had helped her understand that survival was a choice she could make every day. That experience had shaped her career path, driving her to understand resilience and recovery. It had also taught her that some wounds never completely healed. They just became part of who you were. Tomorrow she would return to the base, continue her observations, and try to unravel the psychological mysteries of America's most elite warriors. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being studied as intently as she was studying others, and that Commander Kane saw more than she was comfortable revealing. The sound of waves crashing against the shore outside her window provided a rhythm for her thoughts as she drifted toward sleep, unaware that across the base, Marcus Kane was lying awake in his own quarters, thinking about the young psychologist who asked questions that cut too close to the truth. The diner was exactly the kind of place Sarah had expected to find near a military base. Vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, and coffee that could fuel a week-long operation. At 10:30 on a Wednesday night, they were virtually the only customers, which suited both of them perfectly. Marcus Kane looked different in civilian clothes. More approachable, less intimidating, but somehow more vulnerable. He wore dark jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that revealed muscled arms marked with scars that spoke of a life lived at the edge of violence. Sarah found herself cataloging those scars professionally, then catching herself and looking away. "So," Kane said, wrapping his hands around a ceramic mug that looked fragile in his grip, "what made you want to study trauma?" The directness of his question surprised her. Most people approached the topic obliquely, if at all. "Personal experience," she said simply. "Yours or someone else's?" Sarah studied his face, looking for judgment, and finding only genuine curiosity. "Both." Kane waited, not pushing, giving her space to decide how much she wanted to share. It was an interviewing technique she recognized: create safety through patience and let the subject determine the boundaries. "My younger brother," she said finally. "He was deployed to Afghanistan when he was 19. Came home different." She paused, remembering. "Actually, that's not accurate. He came home broken, and I didn't know how to help him." "What happened to him?" "Suicide. 3 months after he got back." The words came out flat, clinical, drained of emotion through repetition. "I was finishing my master's degree in psychology, thought I understood trauma and recovery. But understanding something academically and living through it are completely different experiences." Kane's expression softened. "I am sorry." "Thank you." Sarah took a sip of coffee, using the pause to compose herself. "That's what started my research focus. I wanted to understand why some people survive trauma and others don't. What factors determine resilience versus breakdown? And what have you learned? That resilience isn't fixed. It's not something you either have or don't have. It's something you build through experience, relationships, and conscious choice." She looked across the table at him. "But it's also something that can be exhausted if you don't know how to replenish it." Kane was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that spoke to personal experience. "Your brother, did he try to get help?" "He went to VA counseling for a few sessions. Said it didn't help, that the therapist couldn't understand what he'd been through." Sarah's fingers found the handle of her mug, gripping it tightly. "He was probably right. How do you explain the reality of combat to someone who's never experienced it?" "You don't," Kane said simply. "You either find someone who has been there, or you carry it alone." There was something in his tone that made Sarah look up sharply. "Is that what you do? Carry it alone?" Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're talking about your brother." "No," Sarah said gently. "We're talking about what happens to people who experience trauma without adequate support systems. That includes you." "I have support systems. I have my team." "Your team that looks to you for leadership and emotional stability? That's not support, Marcus. That's additional responsibility." The use of his first name seemed to surprise him. For a moment, his professional composure slipped, and Sarah saw exhaustion beneath the surface. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but without heat. "Don't I?" Sarah leaned forward slightly. 6 months ago, you lost someone under your command. Since then, according to your team, you've become more controlled, more distant, more careful. You're carrying guilt about a death that probably wasn't your fault, and you have no one to process that guilt with because showing vulnerability would compromise your authority. Kane's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "Chief Williams talks too much. Chief Williams is worried about you. So is Martinez. So is Rodriguez. They see what carrying that weight is doing to you, and they don't know how to help. It's not their job to help. It's their job to follow orders and trust my judgment. And what happens when your judgment becomes compromised by unprocessed trauma? What happens when the weight becomes too much to carry effectively?" Kane stood abruptly, pulling out his wallet. "I should go. Should you?" Sarah remained seated, looking up at him calmly. "Or are you running because this conversation is getting too close to things you don't want to examine?" Kane paused, wallet in hand, and Sarah could see internal struggle playing across his features. "Sit down, Marcus," she said quietly. "Please." After a moment that stretched between them like a held breath, Kane sat back down. But his posture remained defensive, ready for flight. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to tell me about Syria." The words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah watched color drain from his face, saw his breathing change, witnessed the way his body went rigid with control. "That's classified. The operational details are classified. The emotional impact isn't." Sarah kept her voice gentle but persistent. "What was his name?" "Sarah, Dr. Chin, what was his name?" Kane was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Danny Reeves, 24 years old, kid from Ohio who wanted to serve his country and see the world. "Tell me what happened." Kane's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee. "Intelligence failure. We went in expecting light resistance and walked into an ambush. Sniper fire from 3 different positions." Sarah waited, giving him space to continue. "We were pinned down for 47 minutes before air support could clear the area. Danny took a round to the chest in the first 30 seconds. Kane's voice was flat, mechanical, as if reading from a report. "I made the decision to hold position rather than risk exposing the rest of the team to retrieve him immediately." "That sounds like the right tactical decision." "The right tactical decision." Kane's laugh was bitter. "You know what Danny was doing when he got hit? He was covering our retreat route, making sure the rest of us had a way out if things went bad. He was protecting us, and I left him bleeding in the sand for 47 minutes because the tactical situation didn't allow for immediate extraction." Sarah could see the guilt and anguish that Kane had been carrying for 6 months, could understand now why his team was worried about him. "Did he survive the initial wound?" "Yeah." Kane's voice broke slightly. He was conscious, talking to us over comms. Kept asking if we were okay, if we needed him to move to a different position. Even bleeding out, he was more concerned about the mission and the team than himself. "When were you able to reach him?" "Air support cleared the snipers at 47 minutes and 12 seconds. I timed it." Kane's jaw was tight with suppressed emotion. "I reached him at 48 minutes and 31 seconds. He looked up at me and said, 'Sorry, boss. I think I messed up.'" Tears were forming in Kane's eyes, but he continued with the relentless precision of someone who had replayed these moments countless times. "He died 90 seconds later, in my arms, apologizing for getting shot while protecting his teammates." Sarah felt her own eyes burning with sympathetic tears. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. The after-action report concluded that I made the correct tactical decisions throughout the engagement. No fault assigned, no disciplinary action recommended." Kane wiped his eyes roughly. "Perfect operation except for the part where I let a 24-year-old kid die because I prioritized mission success over individual life. You prioritized the lives of your entire team over the life of one team member. That's what command means, making impossible decisions with incomplete information. Tell that to Danny's parents. Tell that to his fiancée who was planning their wedding." Kane's voice was raw with pain. "Tell them that their son and future husband was an acceptable loss in service of tactical objectives." Sarah reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. His skin was warm, callous from years of hard use, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers. "You didn't kill Danny, Marcus. The enemy killed Danny. You did everything you could with the resources and information you had." "Did I?" Kane looked up at her, and Sarah saw in his eyes the same haunted look she had seen in her brother's face. "Because I've been replaying every decision, every moment, every possible alternative for 6 months. And I can think of a dozen things I could have done differently. All of them based on information you didn't have at the time," Sarah pointed out gently. "Hindsight is perfect, but command decisions have to be made in real time with imperfect information." Kane was quiet for a moment, staring at their joined hands. "How do you live with it when your professional decisions cost someone their life?" The question hit Sarah unexpectedly, and she realized that Kane had turned their conversation back to her brother, to her own sense of failure and guilt. "Some days better than others," she admitted. "I tell myself that I was 23 years old, finishing graduate school, that I couldn't have known how serious his symptoms were. But then I remember that I was studying psychology, that I should have seen the signs, should have pushed harder for better treatment. But you weren't responsible for his care. You were his sister, not his therapist. And you weren't responsible for enemy sniper fire. You were Danny's commander, not his guardian angel. Kane looked up at her, and Sarah saw recognition in his eyes, the acknowledgement that they were both carrying guilt for deaths they couldn't have prevented. Survivor guilt, Sarah continued, is one of the most common responses to trauma. We blame ourselves for outcomes beyond our control because feeling guilty is easier than feeling helpless. How do you move past it? You don't move past it. You learn to carry it without letting it destroy you. Sarah's thumb traced across his knuckles unconsciously. You honor the person you lost by living a life that justifies their sacrifice. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, hands linked across the diner table, two people who had found unexpected understanding in shared grief. "Can I ask you something personal?" Kane said finally. Sarah nodded. "The scar on your wrist, is that related to your brother's death?" Sarah's free hand instinctively moved to tug at her sleeve, but Kane's observation was already made. She looked down at their joined hands, considering how much vulnerability she was willing to share. 2 weeks after his funeral, she said quietly, "I was drowning in grief and guilt, convinced that I had failed him in every way that mattered. It seemed like the only way to stop the pain." "What stopped you?" "My therapist called to check on me. Found me in my apartment bathroom with a razor blade and enough determination to use it." Sarah's voice was steady, but Kane could see the effort it took to maintain composure. "She spent 4 hours with me that night, helping me understand that suicide wouldn't honor my brother's memory or solve the problem of his death." Kane lifted their joined hands, studying the faint scar on her wrist with gentle attention. "How long did it take to heal?" "The wound healed in 2 weeks. The underlying trauma took 3 years of intensive therapy and a complete change in career focus." Sarah met his eyes. "But I'm still here. I'm still fighting. And I've dedicated my professional life to understanding trauma and resilience so that maybe other people won't have to suffer the way my brother did." "Is that why you're really here? To save broken seals?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I'm here to understand what makes some people able to process trauma effectively and others unable to cope. But yes, if my research helps prevent even one suicide, then everything I've been through will have meaning." Kane was quiet for a long time, processing everything she had shared. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "I've never told anyone about Danny. Not the details, not how I really feel about it. Why are you telling me?" Kane considered the question carefully. "Because you understand what it's like to carry responsibility for someone's death, even when logic tells you it wasn't your fault. And because you've figured out how to transform that pain into something useful rather than destructive." "Have I?" Sarah laughed without humor. "Some days I'm not so sure. Some days the guilt still feels fresh, and I wonder if I'm doing this research to help other people or to convince myself that I'm not the failure my brother's death makes me feel like." "Maybe both," Kane suggested. "Maybe the best therapists are the ones who've been broken and put themselves back together. And maybe the best commanders are the ones who understand the weight of the decisions they make." Kane's smile was sad but genuine. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Two people trying to save the world to make up for the people we couldn't save. Is that what we're doing? Isn't it?" Kane's thumb brushed across her wrist, directly over the faded scar. "You study trauma to prevent suicide. I push my team to be better so they'll survive whatever comes next. We're both trying to control outcomes we can't actually control." Sarah realized he was right. Despite all her training and self-awareness, she was still fighting the same battle that had nearly killed her 6 years ago. The need to find meaning in senseless loss, to transform pain into purpose. "So what do we do?" she asked. "How do we live with the weight without letting it crush us?" Kane was quiet for a moment, still tracing the outline of her scar with careful attention. "Maybe we learn to share it. Maybe carrying it alone is what makes it unbearable." The suggestion hung between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond their professional relationship. Sarah found herself studying Kane's face, seeing not just the SEAL commander but the man beneath, someone who understood loss and guilt and the terrible burden of responsibility. "That's a dangerous suggestion for someone in your position," she said softly. "Yeah," Kane agreed. "It is." But neither of them pulled away. They sat in the quiet diner, hands linked across the table, two damaged people who had found unexpected solace in shared understanding. Outside, the fog was rolling in from the Pacific, wrapping the world in gray obscurity. But inside, under harsh, fluorescent lights, Sarah Chun and Marcus Kane were discovering that sometimes the most important healing happens not in therapy rooms or medical facilities, but in the simple act of being truly seen by another person who understands what it means to survive when others don't. The days following their conversation in the diner brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the dynamic between Sarah and Marcus. Their professional interactions remained appropriately formal, but there were moments, brief eye contact during team briefings, a shared understanding when discussing trauma responses, the way Marcus unconsciously positioned himself closer to her during group discussions, that spoke to their deepening connection. Sarah found herself more attuned to Marcus's emotional state than was strictly professional. She noticed when his jaw tightened during certain tactical discussions, recognized the signs of a sleepless night in the shadows under his eyes, and felt a protective instinct that had nothing to do with her research objectives. Her interviews with the team continued to provide valuable insights, but she was increasingly aware that her most significant discovery had nothing to do with her original research parameters. She was learning that healing sometimes required breaking protocol, that the most important therapeutic breakthroughs happened in the spaces between formal sessions. On Friday morning, Sarah arrived at the base to find unusual activity in the briefing room. Maps of Southeast Asia covered the tables, and several team members were engaged in what appeared to be operational planning rather than training preparation. Lieutenant Morrison intercepted her before she could enter the briefing area. "Dr. Chun, there's been a development. The team has been activated for actual deployment. They leave tomorrow morning." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Deployment where?" "I can't share operational details, but it's a real-world mission. High priority." Morrison's expression was sympathetic. "This means your research period with the team will be cut short." Through the briefing room windows, Sarah could see Marcus addressing his men with the focused intensity she had learned to recognize as his command persona. But now she also saw what his team had been trying to tell her. The weight he carried, the way responsibility sat on his shoulders like a physical burden. "How long will they be gone?" she asked. "Classified. Could be days, could be weeks, depending on how the situation develops." Sarah spent the morning observing the team's pre-deployment preparations, taking notes on their psychological processes as they transitioned from training mode to operational readiness. But her clinical objectivity was compromised by personal concern, particularly when she watched Marcus reviewing contingency plans with the kind of meticulous attention that spoke to his determination not to lose another team member. During a brief break in planning, Chief Williams approached her workstation. "Doc, I need to tell you something." Sarah looked up from her notes. Williams appeared uncharacteristically serious. "This mission, it's similar to the one where we lost Danny. Same region, similar tactical challenges." Williams kept his voice low. "The commander is wound tighter than I've seen him since Syria. I'm worried about how he's going to handle the pressure." "What kind of mission parameters?" Sarah asked, though she knew Williams probably couldn't share operational details. "Hostage extraction. American contractors taken by a militant group. High probability of armed resistance. Limited extraction window." Williams glanced toward the briefing room where Marcus was reviewing intelligence reports. "It's the kind of operation where split-second decisions mean the difference between bringing everyone home or coming back with casualties." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "Has he discussed the Syria operation with anyone on the team?" "Not directly, but we all know he's carrying it. You can see it in how he approaches mission planning now, triple-checking everything, running scenarios until he's exhausted, pushing the team harder in training because he's terrified of making another mistake. That level of hypervigilance can actually compromise decision-making ability," Sarah said, more to herself than to Williams. "That's what I'm afraid of. In our line of work, overthinking can be as dangerous as underthinking. Williams paused. I don't know what you two talked about the other night, but he seemed different afterward. Lighter, maybe, like someone had lifted some weight off his shoulders. Sarah realized that Williams knew about their diner conversation, though she wasn't sure how much he had guessed about what they had discussed. He's carrying trauma that he hasn't processed, she said carefully. In civilian contexts, we would recommend intensive therapy before returning someone to high-stress situations. Yeah, well, we don't have that luxury. Mission launches in 18 hours whether the commander is psychologically ready or not. The afternoon brought Sarah's final scheduled interviews with team members, but her attention kept drifting to Marcus as he moved between tactical planning and equipment preparation. She could see the signs of escalating stress, increased muscle tension, rapid speech patterns, the way he checked and rechecked details that were already perfectly organized. At 4 o'clock, Marcus dismissed the team for final personal preparations. As the briefing room emptied, Sarah found herself alone with him for the first time since their conversation at the diner. "How are you holding up?" she asked without preamble. Marcus looked up from the intelligence reports he was reviewing for what was probably the 10th time. "I'm Phoenix." "No, you're not. You're spiraling into hypervigilance and second-guessing, which are classic trauma responses to situations that trigger previous traumatic experiences." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'm being thorough. You're being obsessive. There's a difference." Sarah approached his position at the head of the table. "You've reviewed those intelligence reports dozens of times. You've run contingency scenarios until your team is exhausted. You're preparing for this mission like you're trying to control every variable that contributed to Danny's death." "Maybe I am." Marcus's voice was sharp with defensive anger. "Maybe if I'm thorough enough, careful enough, paranoid enough, I won't have to watch another kid die because I missed something important. Or maybe you'll be so focused on preventing the last tragedy that you'll miss the unique dangers of this mission." Marcus stood abruptly, scattering the papers he had been reviewing. "You don't understand what you're talking about. You've never been responsible for leading people into combat." "You're right. I haven't." Sarah remained calm in the face of his agitation. "But I have spent 7 years studying how unprocessed trauma affects decision-making under stress. And I've watched what happened to my brother when he tried to carry emotional weight that was too heavy for one person to bear alone. Your brother wasn't responsible for other people's lives. Neither are you. Not ultimately." Sarah stepped closer to him. "You're responsible for making the best decisions you can with the information you have. You're responsible for leading your team effectively and bringing your expertise to the mission. But you're not responsible for controlling enemy actions, intelligence failures, or random variables that no amount of planning can predict." Marcus was breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Tell me that if we come back with casualties. Tell me that when I'm standing at another funeral, explaining to another family why their son isn't coming home. I'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. You're not God. Marcus, you cannot control every outcome, and trying to do so will compromise your ability to lead effectively when your team needs you most." For a moment, Sarah thought Marcus might walk away, might shut down the conversation the way he had tried to shut down their discussion at the diner. But instead, he sat down heavily in one of the briefing room chairs, suddenly looking older than his years. "I keep seeing Danny's face," he said quietly. "I keep replaying those 47 minutes, thinking about what I could have done differently." Sarah pulled up a chair, facing him. "What do you see when you replay it? All the ways I failed him. All the decisions that led to his death. What does Danny see when he looks at those same 47 minutes?" Marcus looked up, confused by the question. "You said he was conscious, talking to you over comms. What did he say during those 47 minutes?" Marcus closed his eyes, clearly accessing painful memories. He kept asking about the team, wanted to know if we were safe, if we needed him to move to provide better cover. Even bleeding out, he was trying to do his job. "Did he blame you for the tactical decisions you made?" "No." He kept apologizing for getting hit, for not being able to complete his part of the mission. So Danny spent his final conscious moments focused on serving his team and completing the mission. He died doing exactly what he was trained to do, protecting the people he cared about. Sarah's voice was gentle but insistent. That's not failure, Marcus. That's heroism. Tears were forming in Marcus's eyes again. But you should have what? Magically predicted sniper positions that intelligence didn't identify? Developed supernatural powers that allowed you to control enemy actions. Sarah leaned forward. You made tactical decisions that saved 11 lives. The fact that you couldn't save the 12th doesn't negate the 11 who went home because of your leadership. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing her words. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. How do I do this? How do I lead another mission when I can't stop seeing his face? You honor Danny by being the leader he believed you were. You used the lessons you learned from his sacrifice to make better decisions for the team you're leading now. Sarah reached across the space between their chairs, taking his hand. And you remember that Danny died protecting something he valued, his teammates and his mission. The best way to honor that sacrifice is to come back alive and bring your team home with you. Marcus's fingers tightened around hers. What if I make the wrong decision again? Then you make it based on the best information you have, just like Danny would want you to. And you trust that your team understands the risks and chooses to follow you anyway. They sat in the quiet briefing room as afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows. Two people sharing a moment of vulnerability before Marcus returned to the weight of command responsibility. I have to finish mission prep, Marcus said finally, though he didn't immediately release her hand. I know. Sarah squeezed his fingers gently. Can I ask you to do something for me? What? When you're out there, making those split-second decisions, remember that you're not just carrying Danny's memory. You're also carrying the trust of 11 men who believe in your judgment and your ability to bring them home. Marcus nodded, though Sarah could see he was still struggling with the emotional weight of the upcoming deployment. There's something else, Sarah said, making a decision that crossed every professional boundary she had ever maintained. I want you to have my personal phone number. If you need to talk when you get back, if the mission brings up trauma that you need to process, I want you to know you have someone who understands. Marcus looked surprised. That's not very professional. No, it's not. But some things are more important than professional protocol. Sarah reached into her bag, pulling out one of her business cards and writing her personal cell number on the back. Some healing requires breaking the rules. Marcus took the card, studying her handwriting. Why are you doing this? Because I've learned that the most important therapeutic relationships happen in the spaces between formal sessions. Because I've seen what happens when people try to carry trauma alone. And because Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. Because I care about what happens to you in ways that have nothing to do with my research. The admission hung between them, changing something fundamental in their relationship. Marcus looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude, affection, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. Sarah, he said, and the way he spoke her name carried weight beyond simple address. I know, she said softly. I know this complicates everything. But sometimes the most important connections happen at the worst possible times. Marcus stood, still holding her business card. I should go. The team needs final briefings, and I have equipment checks to complete. Of course. Sarah stood as well, suddenly aware of how small the space between them had become. Marcus. He paused in gathering his materials. Bring them home. All of them, including yourself. Marcus's smile was tired, but genuine. I'll do my best. That's all Danny would ask of you. That's all any of us can ask. As Marcus left the briefing room, Sarah remained behind, staring at the tactical maps and intelligence reports that would soon guide 13 men into danger. For the first time since beginning her research, she understood viscerally what it meant to have someone you cared about walking into situations where your influence ended and fate took over. That evening, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on transcribing interview notes. Instead, she sat in her hotel room, staring at the Pacific Ocean and thinking about the strange turns her life had taken in the past week. She had come to Coronado to study SEAL psychology, and found herself emotionally invested in the well-being of a man whose job required him to face death as a regular occupational hazard. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Sarah's heart jumped when she saw Marcus's name on the screen. "Thank you for today, for understanding, for caring enough to break the rules. I'll call when I get back." Sarah stared at the message for a long time before typing her response. "Come home safe. That's an order from your psychologist." His reply came quickly. "Yes, ma'am." As Sarah prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the conversation they hadn't finished, about the feelings they hadn't fully acknowledged, about the impossibility of timing when it came to human connection. She had come to study how warriors process trauma, but instead she had learned something about her own capacity for emotional investment. Tomorrow, Marcus Kane would lead his team into danger, carrying the weight of past losses and the responsibility for future outcomes. And Sarah would wait, understanding for the first time what military families experienced every time their loved ones deployed into uncertainty. She fell asleep, holding her phone, unconsciously waiting for messages that wouldn't come until the mission was over, and Marcus could safely contact the outside world again. 14 days. That's how long Sarah waited without word from Marcus or his team. 14 days of checking her phone obsessively, of calling Lieutenant Morrison for updates that never came, of trying to focus on her research while her mind kept wandering to dangerous places where anything could be happening to 13 men she had come to care about. On the 15th morning, Sarah was in her hotel room packing her research materials when her phone finally rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah's hand shook as she answered. "Marcus, we're back." His voice was hoarse, exhausted, but alive. "We're all back." Sarah sank into the hotel room chair, relief flooding through her system. "Thank God. Are you okay? Is everyone okay?" "Physically, yes. Emotionally." Marcus paused. "Can you meet me somewhere? I need to talk to someone who understands." "Of course. Where?" "There's a beach access point about 2 miles south of the base. It's usually empty this time of day. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Sarah found Marcus sitting on a piece of driftwood, staring out at the Pacific Ocean. He was wearing civilian clothes, faded jeans, and a navy t-shirt, but his posture carried the weight of recent command decisions. Dark circles under his eyes spoke to sleepless nights, and there was a new tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before deployment. "Hi," Sarah said softly, settling beside him on the driftwood. Marcus didn't look away from the ocean. "How was your week?" And a half, without seals to study. "Long worried, completely unproductive from a research standpoint." Sarah studied his profile. "How was your mission?" Marcus was quiet for several minutes, and Sarah began to wonder if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "We got them out. All 4 contractors, alive and relatively unharmed. Minimal enemy casualties, no friendly fire incidents, textbook extraction. But everything that could go wrong without actually causing casualties went wrong. Intelligence was partially incorrect. Enemy force strength was underestimated. Extraction window was cut in half due to weather complications." Marcus picked up a handful of sand, letting it run through his fingers. "For 12 hours, I was making decisions with incomplete information while people's lives hung in the balance." Sarah waited, giving him space to process at his own pace. "I kept thinking about Danny. Every time we encountered unexpected resistance, every time I had to choose between aggressive action and cautious withdrawal, I could see his face." Marcus's jaw tightened. "There was one moment we were pinned down by sniper fire almost identical to Syria, and I froze. For maybe 10 seconds, I couldn't make any decision because I was too busy replaying Danny's death." "What happened?" Rodriguez took initiative, laid down suppressive fire that allowed us to advance. "He'd probably saved the mission and maybe saved lives." Marcus finally looked at Sarah. 10 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in combat, 10 seconds of indecision can mean the difference between success and catastrophe. But the mission was successful. Everyone came home. This time, Marcus's voice was heavy. "What happens next time when freezing up for 10 seconds gets someone killed. Sarah turned to face him fully. What did you learn from those 10 seconds? That I'm not ready to command. That I haven't processed Danny's death enough to be effective under pressure. Is that what you learned? Or is that what your guilt is telling you? Sarah's voice was gentle, but challenging. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you learned that your team is well-trained enough to compensate for momentary hesitation, that you've built a culture of initiative and adaptability that allowed them to respond effectively when you needed time to process. Marcus shook his head. You're missing the point. I shouldn't need time to process during active operations. I should have dealt with this trauma before putting my team at risk. Should have dealt with it how? Through what resources? With what support system? Sarah's tone sharpened slightly. You're a SEAL commander carrying classified operational guilt with no safe space to process trauma, and no one in your chain of command who you can show vulnerability to. What exactly were you supposed to do differently? Marcus was quiet, and Sarah could see him wrestling with her logic. The military doesn't provide adequate psychological resources for people in your position, she continued. You're expected to be invulnerable while making decisions that would break most people. The fact that you experienced 10 seconds of trauma response during a situation that directly paralleled your most painful memory isn't failure. It's human. Human doesn't cut it when people's lives are on the line. Human is exactly what cuts it. Your humanity, your capacity to feel loss and guilt and responsibility is what makes you a leader worth following. Sarah shifted closer to him on the driftwood. Do you think your team would trust you more if you were a sociopath who felt nothing when people died under your command? Of course not. Then, why are you punishing yourself for having normal human responses to trauma? Marcus picked up another handful of sand, watching it fall through his fingers. Because I can't afford normal human responses. My job requires me to be better than human. No, it doesn't. It requires you to be the best human you can be while acknowledging your limitations and finding ways to work within them. Sarah touched his arm gently. Tell me about the rest of the mission. What happened after those 10 seconds? Marcus was quiet for a moment, accessing memories. I remembered what you said about honoring Danny by being the leader he believed I was. I stopped trying to prevent his death and started focusing on the mission in front of me. And we completed the extraction flawlessly. No casualties, objectives achieved, team performance was exceptional. Marcus's voice carried a note of surprise. It was actually textbook special operations, adaptive, efficient, successful. So you had 10 seconds of trauma response followed by several hours of exceptional leadership under extreme pressure. Yeah, that sounds like healing to me. That sounds like someone who is learning to carry trauma without being controlled by it. Marcus looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed hope and uncertainty. You really think so? I know so. The fact that you could recognize the trauma response, process it quickly, and refocus on the mission shows incredible psychological resilience. Sarah smiled. You're not the same person who lost Danny 6 months ago. You're someone who has integrated that loss into your leadership style without letting it paralyze you. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching waves crash against the shore. Sarah was acutely aware of Marcus's proximity, of the way his presence made her feel both calm and electrically alert. There's something else, Marcus said eventually. What? During the mission, when things were most uncertain, I kept thinking about you. About our conversation in the diner, about the way you understood what I was carrying. Marcus turned to look at her directly. I've never had anyone in my life who could see the weight I carry and not be afraid of it. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Marcus, I know this complicates everything. I know you have professional boundaries, and I have command responsibilities. But I can't pretend that what's happening between us is just therapeutic. Sarah had been dreading and hoping for this conversation in equal measure. What is happening between us? You tell me. You're the psychologist. Sarah laughed despite the seriousness of the moment. Psychology doesn't cover everything. Sometimes people connect in ways that transcend professional categories. Is that what we're doing? Connecting? Sarah looked at Marcus, really looked at him. She saw the scars and the shadows, the weight he carried, and the strength he developed to bear it. She saw someone who understood loss and responsibility and the price of caring too much. And she saw someone who saw her with equal clarity. "Yes," she said simply. "We're connecting." Marcus reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with careful intention. "Where does that leave us? You have a career, probably a life somewhere else. I have a team and responsibilities that could send me anywhere in the world at any time." "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I've never been in this situation before." "What situation?" "Caring about someone whose job requires them to walk into danger on a regular basis." Sarah squeezed his fingers, discovering feelings that don't fit into any professional or personal category I understand. "Are you willing to figure it out as we go?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Marcus Kane represented everything that scared her about emotional investment. Uncertainty, danger, the possibility of loss that she had spent years learning to avoid. But he also represented something she had never expected to find: genuine understanding, shared experience of trauma, and healing, connection that felt inevitable despite its impossibility. "Are you asking me to date a SEAL commander?" she asked. "I'm asking you to take a chance on something neither of us planned, but both of us recognize as important." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with fear and desire in equal measure. "I want to," she said finally, "but I'm terrified." "Of what?" "Of caring about someone who might not come home. Of opening myself up to loss again. Of compromising my professional judgment because of personal feelings." Sarah met his eyes. "Of discovering that what I feel for you is real and permanent and completely impractical." Marcus lifted their joined hands, pressing his lips to her knuckles gently. "What if we start with something simple? What if we start with honesty about what we're feeling and see where it leads?" "Honesty, honesty." Marcus's smile was soft. "I'll start. I'm falling for a psychologist who sees me more clearly than I see myself, who understands the weight I carry without trying to take it away from me. Someone who makes me want to be better than I am while accepting who I am right now." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "That's not simple at all." "Your turn." Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm falling for a warrior who carries other people's pain like it's his own, who leads through competence and compassion, who makes me want to risk emotional investment despite every logical reason to protect myself." So we're both falling. Apparently. Marcus stood, pulling Sarah to her feet beside him. "Want to walk with me?" They walked along the shoreline in comfortable silence, hands linked, two people beginning to navigate the complexity of connection that transcended their original roles. Sarah found herself studying Marcus's profile, memorizing details. The way afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, the confident stride that spoke to physical conditioning and mental discipline, the way he unconsciously scanned their surroundings even in this peaceful moment. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they paused to watch surfers in the distance. "Anything. What happens to your research now? Do you have enough data for your study?" Sarah realized she hadn't thought about her research objectives in days. "I have more data than I expected, but not the kind I originally planned to collect." "What kind do you have?" "Real-world observations about resilience, trauma processing, and the importance of connection and healing." Sarah smiled wryly. "Also extensive notes about my own psychological responses to emotional investment in research subjects." "Are you going to publish those?" "God, no. That would end my career faster than dating a SEAL commander." Marcus laughed, and Sarah realized it was the first genuinely carefree sound she had heard from him. "So we're both risking our careers?" "Apparently." Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "Worth it? Ask me in 6 months." They found a secluded section of beach where massive rocks created natural privacy. Sarah settled against one of the sun-warmed stones, and Marcus positioned himself beside her, close enough that she could feel his body heat. "Tell me about your family," Marcus said. "Besides your brother." "Small family. Parents divorced when I was 15, both remarried. I have a half-sister from my father's second marriage who's still in high school." Sarah adjusted her position to face him more directly. What about you? Only child. Parents are retired. Living in Florida, completely mystified by my career choice. Marcus's expression grew fond. They wanted me to be an accountant or an engineer, something safe and predictable. Do they worry about you? Constantly. My mother calls every week to ask if I've considered civilian employment. Marcus smiled. What would you tell them about their son? That he's devoted his life to protecting others, that he carries responsibility with grace and competence, that he's stronger than he knows and more human than he gives himself credit for. Sarah paused. That he's someone worth worrying about and worth being proud of. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You see me very clearly. You see me clearly too. That's part of what makes this so terrifying and so compelling. As afternoon faded toward evening, they talked about everything and nothing. Childhood memories, career dreams, books, and movies, and the small details that create intimacy between two people learning to know each other beyond their professional roles. When the sun began to set, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and orange, Marcus pulled Sarah closer against his side. I have to tell you something, he said quietly. What? I'm scheduled for another deployment in 6 weeks. Different mission, different location, but probably gone for at least a month. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Okay. Is it? Okay. Sarah considered the question honestly. No, it's not okay. It scares me, and I hate it, and I wish your job didn't require you to go to dangerous places. She leaned into his warmth. But I understand that it's who you are and what you do, and I respect that even when it terrifies me. What does that mean for us? It means we figure out how to build something that can survive your deployment schedule and my research travel and the complications of caring about each other across distance and uncertainty. Sarah looked up at him. It means we decide that what we're building is worth the effort and the risk. Marcus kissed her forehead gently. Are you deciding that? Are you? Yeah, I am. Then so am I. As darkness began to fall, they walked back toward their cars, hands linked. Two people who had found each other in the last place either had expected to discover love. The practical complications of their situation hadn't disappeared, but they had acknowledged something more important, that some connections are worth the effort required to sustain them. Sarah, Marcus said as they reached the parking area. Yes. Thank you. For what? For seeing me. For understanding what I carry. For being brave enough to care about someone whose life doesn't fit into normal categories. Marcus cupped her face gently. For helping me remember that healing is possible even when you think you're too broken to put back together. Sarah stood on her toes, kissing him softly. Thank you for showing me that some rules are worth breaking and some risks are worth taking. As they drove away in separate cars, Sarah found herself smiling despite the uncertainty ahead. She had come to Coronado to study how elite warriors process trauma and maintained resilience. Instead, she had discovered that healing often requires connection, that strength sometimes means vulnerability, and that the most important discoveries happen not in research labs, but in the moments when two people recognize themselves in each other. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Dinner tomorrow? Somewhere with better coffee than the diner. Sarah typed her response. Yes. But I like the diner. That's where we learn to be honest with each other. His reply came quickly. Then, the diner it is. 7 o'clock. It's a date. Yes, Marcus wrote back. It is. Sarah drove through the Coronado night, thinking about trauma and healing, about connection and courage, about the unexpected ways that life reshapes itself around the people who matter most. She had learned more about resilience in 2 weeks with Marcus Kane than in 3 years of formal research, and she suspected that their story was just beginning. Behind her, the Pacific Ocean continued its eternal rhythm against the shore, witness to countless arrivals and departures, hellos and goodbyes, moments of recognition that change everything. And somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Kane was driving toward his own future, carrying the weight of command and the possibility of love, two burdens that no longer seemed incompatible. Some healing happens in therapy rooms with trained professionals. But sometimes, Sarah had learned, the most important healing happens between two people who see each other clearly and choose connection despite all the logical reasons to maintain distance. Sometimes the most important discovery is not what you're looking for, but what finds you when you're finally ready to be found.